A wedding planner forwarded me our engagement party's guest list on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. A routine email I almost skimmed past before a small handwritten style note beside my own name stopped me cold. Do not let her speak privately with the groom's family. My name is Claire Monroe. I'm 29. I work as a museum exhibit coordinator outside Boston, Massachusetts, a job that has spent 6 years training me to notice the specific gap between what a placard tells visitors and what the actual object in the case is trying to say instead, the tiny inconsistency between a described provenance and what the material evidence actually supports. I stared at that note for a long time before I called our planner directly. Her name is Rosalind, and she sounded genuinely uncomfortable once I asked her about it. Your fiancé's mother added that, she said. I assumed you already knew about the arrangement. I told her I didn't know about any arrangement at all. David and I met 3 years ago at a fundraising gala for the museum where I work, both of us hiding near the same dessert table, trying to avoid a particularly long-winded donor speech. And I fell for him the specific, easy way you fall for someone who makes ordinary moments feel considerably lighter just by being present in them. We got engaged 8 months ago, a genuinely happy proposal at the aquarium where we'd had our first date, both of us laughing at how unromantic it seemed until he actually got down on one knee in front of the jellyfish tank, a moment 2 teenagers nearby applauded loudly enough to draw a small crowd. His mother, Vivian, had never been especially warm toward me, a specific, cool politeness I'd learned to navigate over our 2 years together. Comments about my creative career delivered with just enough emphasis to suggest she considered it a hobby rather than a genuine profession. Questions about my own family background that always seemed to carry a specific, appraising undertone. Nothing had ever struck me as actively hostile, though until roughly a month before that email arrived. David's family carried a specific kind of old money weight. His grandmother, Margaret, controlling a trust, and a family manufacturing business that had supported 3 generations before David's own. A company his own father had walked away from decades earlier, choosing medicine instead, a decision that had apparently generated its own lingering family tension long before I ever entered the picture. I'd met Margaret exactly 4 times, each interaction carrying a formal, appraising quality I'd never fully understood, David always explaining it away as simply, how she is with everyone at first. An explanation I'd accepted mostly, because I wanted to believe it. A friend of mine from David's extended family circle, a cousin named Bate I genuinely liked from the moment we met at David's own birthday dinner 2 years earlier, called me roughly 2 weeks before that guest list email, her voice careful and hesitant in a way that immediately told me something was wrong before she'd said a single specific word. I don't want this to be weird, Bate said, but I have to ask you something directly. Are you pregnant? I told her no, genuinely confused by the question, sitting down slowly at my own kitchen table as she explained further. Vivian had mentioned it to several relatives at a family dinner roughly a week earlier, framing it, according to Bates' account, as a private, sympathetic concern that I might be using a pregnancy to secure the wedding. Before David had fully committed to the marriage on his own terms, delivered, Bates said, with a specific tone of wounded, motherly worry that had apparently moved at least 2 relatives to genuine sympathy on David's behalf. I hadn't told anyone I was pregnant, because I wasn't. I hadn't even discussed the general topic of children with most of David's relatives at all, a subject David and I had only begun exploring privately, between the 2 of us, in the vaguest possible terms. David's reaction, when I told him about that call from Bate later that same evening, was dismissive in a way that troubled me more than I initially let myself acknowledge. My mom's just anxious about the wedding, he said, barely looking up from his phone. She says things sometimes that don't come out right. I'll talk to her. I asked him whether he actually had talked to her, a few days later, once enough time had passed that a conversation should reasonably have happened. He said he had, though I never saw or heard any direct evidence of that conversation happening. No follow-up call from Vivian, no correction relayed back through Bate or anyone else. A specific pattern I noticed, but at the time, chose to set aside rather than push further, telling myself I was being oversensitive during an already stressful planning period. That guest list note arrived roughly 2 weeks after Bates' call, on a Tuesday, and once I saw it, I asked Rosalind directly whether there had been other communications about me she hadn't mentioned during our regular planning calls. Rosalind hesitated long enough on the phone that I could hear her deciding something on the other end of the line, then told me she'd send over the full email thread, explaining that she'd been uncomfortable with parts of it herself, but hadn't known how to raise the issue without potentially losing the contract. A family this size representing, she admitted quietly, a considerable portion of her business for the entire season. That thread arrived within the hour, and reading it changed everything I understood about the preceding 2 months. Vivian had emailed Rosalind's staff 3 weeks earlier, instructing them to keep me positioned away from Margaret during any unsupervised moments at the upcoming engagement party, language specific and deliberate enough that it clearly wasn't simple wedding day anxiety, a phrase that read, on second and third reading, like actual event choreography rather than any passing concern. A separate message, further down the thread, referenced the pregnancy rumor directly, Vivian writing to her own sister that I was desperate to secure the wedding, and that the family needed to manage the narrative carefully before things went further. A specific phrase, manage the narrative, that made my hands go cold reading it at my own kitchen table. I sat with my laptop open for a long time before I could make myself keep reading, the late afternoon light shifting across my kitchen wall while I worked through message after message, each one adding another layer to a plan I still couldn't quite believe had actually been unfolding around me for weeks. A draft document was attached near the bottom of that same thread, something Vivian's assistant had apparently prepared and circulated for internal family review. A proposed announcement describing me as emotionally unstable and stating that the engagement was being reconsidered given recent concerns. A document dated to be read aloud, according to a scheduling note beside it, during the toasts at our own engagement party, complete with a suggested time slot, 7:40 in the evening, nestled between the appetizer course and the main meal. I called a friend from law school that same evening, someone who now practices family and contract law, not because I anticipated needing formal legal action yet, but because I needed someone to help me understand exactly what I was looking at and what my actual options were. Her name is Priya, and she reviewed the emails I forwarded her carefully before telling me, plainly, that while nothing here necessarily rose to a clear-cut legal claim on its own, documenting everything thoroughly mattered enormously regardless of where this situation eventually landed, especially given the reputational language involved. "Don't confront anyone yet," Priya said. "Get Rosalind to confirm, in writing, that she'll preserve this thread, and figure out what David actually knew before you decide what you're dealing with." I asked David directly to meet me the following evening, at our own apartment rather than anywhere public, and I want to describe that conversation carefully, because I think the specific shape of his answers matters more than any single dramatic moment could. I placed my laptop on our coffee table, the email thread open, and asked him whether he'd known his family was planning to announce our engagement was being reconsidered during our own party. He didn't deny it immediately, which told me something before he said a single word, his eyes moving across the screen, scrolling slightly, reading portions he was clearly seeing for the first time even as others seemed to land with an unsurprised, resigned weight. He admitted, slowly, that his grandmother had, in fact, threatened to remove him from the family trust, and from an executive position at the company if he married me, that Margaret had a specific candidate in mind from within their own social circle, someone named Whitney whose own family held long-standing business ties to Margaret's company, a name I genuinely never heard before that exact moment. "I never approved the pregnancy thing," David said. "I promise you that. I found out about it secondhand, same as you basically." "But you knew," I said. "You knew and you didn't correct it." He was quiet for a long moment, his hands pressed flat against his own knees. "I thought," he said finally, "that if the family just kind of handled things their way, it might make everything easier eventually. I didn't think it through fully. I know that sounds terrible saying it out loud. I asked him whether handled things their way meant the specific plan to announce our engagement was ending in front of our own guests during our own party. He admitted, finally, that he'd exchanged messages with his mother about handling the breakup after the party. A phrase he'd apparently used himself, understanding on some level that this outcome was already being treated as settled by his own family before he'd ever discussed any of it honestly with me. A specific admission that landed in that room with a weight that made the rest of the conversation feel, in some ways, almost unnecessary. I asked him one more question that evening, the one I think mattered most. Were you planning to actually go through with the engagement party at all, or was it always going to be the setting where this ended? He didn't have a clean answer for that either, and I sat with him in silence for several minutes, both of us staring at the same laptop screen, before I finally closed it and told him I needed the night alone to think. I contacted Rosalind again the following morning, asking her directly whether she'd preserve the complete email chain and provide me a written account of what she'd been instructed to do, understanding that whatever happened next, I needed this documented clearly by someone outside the family entirely. She agreed without hesitation, telling me she'd felt genuinely uneasy about the entire arrangement for weeks and had simply not known how to raise it appropriately with a paying client's family, especially given how much of her season's revenue this single event represented. I arranged one final meeting at the venue itself, 3 days before the scheduled engagement party, David and Rosalind both present, understanding that I needed this conversation to happen somewhere with a witness rather than in the private, deniable space of our own apartment. I laid the printed emails on the table between us and asked David, directly, in front of Rosalind, whether he'd been negotiating his own future behind my back this entire time. Vivian arrived partway through that conversation, apparently expecting to review final party logistics with Rosalind, and I watched her face shift, in real time, once she understood exactly what documentation was sitting on that table, her own composure cracking in a way I'd never once witnessed across 2 years of careful, cool politeness. You had no right to go through private family communications, Vivian said, her voice sharp, directed at me rather than at her own son. Rosalind forwarded a guest list with instructions about me on it, I said. I didn't go looking for anything. It came to me. Rosalind confirmed, calmly, exactly what she'd been instructed to do regarding restricting my access to certain guests, and confirmed, separately, the existence of the draft announcement her office had been asked to help coordinate timing for, her voice carrying a specific, professional steadiness that seemed to genuinely unsettle Vivian more than anything I'd said myself. I told the room, plainly, that I was canceling the engagement party myself, not as any kind of dramatic retaliation, but because I refused to walk into a room where my own role had already been written by people who'd never once discussed any of it with me directly. I returned David's ring that same afternoon, sitting with him briefly outside the venue once his mother had left, both of us considerably quieter than the anger from inside that meeting room might have suggested, the ring feeling strangely light in my palm as I set it down on the small table between us. Priya helped me formally recover a portion of the wedding deposits over the following weeks, a process that took some time given the specific contract terms involved, requiring several careful rounds of correspondence with the venue and various vendors before a reasonable partial refund was actually secured, and Rosalind provided a written statement confirming, clearly, that the event's cancellation stemmed directly from the family's own planned conduct, rather than from any instability on my part. Vivian continued. According to what Bate told me secondhand months later, telling relatives some version of her original story, that I'd been unstable, that the family had made a difficult but necessary decision. I chose not to publish any of the private messages or emails publicly, understanding that doing so would only extend a conflict I genuinely wanted to close rather than escalate. And Priya confirmed that the documented email chain itself, sitting quietly in my own records, offered sufficient protection if that particular story ever traveled somewhere it genuinely needed correcting. David contacted me roughly 4 months later, a single email, careful and considerably more honest than anything he'd managed to say to me in person during those final weeks. He told me he'd formally rejected his grandmother's condition, that he'd walked away from both the trust and the executive position rather than marry someone chosen for him, and that he understood now exactly how much damage his own silence had caused, regardless of what he'd eventually decided afterward. I read that email twice before I responded, and I want to describe honestly what I told him, because I think it closes this specific chapter more truthfully than any angrier response might have. I told him that choosing me after losing the money didn't undo the fact that he'd allowed his own family to plan my humiliation in the first place, that the choice he was finally making now had arrived considerably too late to change what I already understood about how he'd actually behaved when it mattered most. I enrolled in a small evening art class the following month, something I genuinely wanted to do for years but had kept postponing, first for work, then for wedding planning that never actually happened. I remember walking into that first session, phone turned off in my bag, no ring on my hand, sitting down at an easel beside people who knew absolutely nothing about the version of me his family had spent months quietly constructing. Nobody in that room needed convincing that I wasn't unstable, wasn't manipulative, wasn't any of the careful language that draft announcement had prepared for a party that never actually happened. I was simply, quietly, just myself again, mixing paint colors that had nothing to do with anyone else's story about who I was supposed to be. My fiancé's family spent months constructing a narrative that I was unstable and manipulative, certain that a false pregnancy rumor and a carefully timed public announcement would let them end our engagement while making me look like the problem. What they never accounted for was a wedding planner uncomfortable enough with her own instructions to forward the wrong email, and a woman whose entire career had trained her to notice exactly when the story being told doesn't match what's actually sitting in front of her. If you've ever discovered that a family had quietly decided your role in their story before ever bothering to ask you, I hope you find your own version of that guest list. Tell me in the comments, would you have canceled the party yourself, or let it happen and confronted them publicly instead?